So if you get another 483, you'll come back.
Yeah. Well, it's, I'm not going to say yes or no, but I would love to visit with you again. Yeah.
I heard a rumor, since you were talking about upgrading the facility, I heard a rumor that you were taking equipment out of your 503B and putting it into an A to potentially do GLP-1s. Can you confirm or deny? Hey, thanks for joining. I'm Sabina, the founder of GLP Winner. Today I'm talking to the COO of ProRx, and it's funny because his team reached out to me asking if I wanted to talk to him about all the chaos that's going on in the compounded access space. And I kind of feel like I'm being tricked into making a podcast. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but subscribe if you want to see if that's the actual outcome. And of course, nothing that either of us say is medical, legal, or financial advice. We're just going to discuss what's going on in the industry. So I'm going to bring him in, inviting Kurt. Is it Lunkwitz?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Great pronunciation. And thanks for having me, and a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, just curious, when I was looking into you, so first of all, why ProRx is interesting right now is that the FDA has released a statement April 1st talking about changes to compounded GLP-1s. ProRx stopped compounding GLP-1s around the 8th or 9th of April. And then BPI just stopped, which is another 503B compounding pharmacy, last week. Compounding pharmacies generally are 503B, 503A. Obviously, this is an oversimplification, but 503Bs tend to be doing larger volumes. And then today, which we didn't even talk about it before we started recording, the FDA released another statement talking about, it was a proposal to remove all GLP-1s from the 503B bulks list. So it's been very, very busy. ProRx has been one of, obviously, the first 503B to stop offering GLP-1s. I would love to get a sense of kind of like where that's going, and we'll be talking about it. I'm curious, first, you're the COO of ProRx, right? You're the
Correct.
founder and president of BoomRx, which is like software for compounding pharmacies and helping people navigate that, right?
Pharmacy portal software, yes.
Yeah. And then you're the CEO and principal of New Care API, which is API for compounding.
API would be referring specifically to
active pharmaceutical ingredient?
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes, pharmaceutical ingredients.
Yeah, because I have a tech background. When I first read that, I was like, is this a tech company?
Yeah, that can be confusing in this world. There's two APIs.
Yeah, we're pharmacy all the way down, right? Given those are all important roles at all three of those companies. And I also saw that you were a founder of Vitality Health South Florida, which is like a telehealth. How do you practically, how do you balance time between those, and like how much time are you spending in each role?
It's a great question. I'll say it's not easy and it's a lot of work, but I think you looking at that, you've deduced information that maybe other people have looked over, which is supply chain. And that is essentially where I operate. Vitality Health, that's a medical clinic, brick and mortar, that also sees patients, telemedicine. But if you look at the remainder of what I do, we're talking about the complete supply chain from the manufacturing of pharmaceutical ingredients, the distribution of the pharmaceutical ingredients. New Care Pharmaceuticals is an NABP accredited API distributor, pharmaceutical distributor, licensed in 50 states. So this is a critical piece of our infrastructure, as is ProRx, other pharmacies that we own or have partnership in, and then that really runs all the way to Boom. And I think having that explanation and understanding the supply chain and being able to work entirely the way through it and having control for creating and patient access and providing patient access is why we're doing what we're doing. And it'll tie into any questions that you likely have about ProRx.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like, help me understand. You joined ProRx in November 2024, and I know there was, I think, an acquisition or an ownership change with ProRx. I assume you joined after that. Can you help me understand the corporate structure of ProRx in relation to other pharmacies, relation to Perfect RX?
Happy to do it. So ProRx 503B outsourcing facility. It was up for sale. The acquisition was made late 2024, November, December, right in that time frame. There was a 483 that was issued to ProRx prior to our acquisition, but we were, just for the record, we were aware of the 483. We knew what was there. And it was one of the reasons why we made the acquisition in the first place. We knew that we had the pharmacy team, the talent, the staff, the FDA consultants, the 503B consultants that had been in the industry for years. And for us to have then the ability to go in and work diligently to clean that up, which is what we spent a lot of time doing in 2025, is handling each observation made by the FDA in that 483, following compliance, keeping correspondence, and then, the proof, which is doing the work and doing the work that was requested during the observations, right? So, but the initial acquisition, ProRx, is a piece of our infrastructure at large for the compounding pharmacy, direct-to-patient space for medical clinics and medical spas. So the timing of it was really just the onset of a much larger business plan.
Okay. And then for context for our audience who maybe doesn't follow pharmacy as closely as us, a 483 is like a letter from the FDA saying, hey, when we inspected you, we saw these things that we wanted changed or didn't like. Sometimes they're not a big deal. Sometimes they are a big deal. And correct me if this timeline is wrong. So there was a 483 given in August 2nd, 2024 for ProRx. And then they did a voluntary recall of semaglutide August 22nd, 2024. And then in the time period, ProRx actually stopped compounding sterile products from August 7th, and then notified the FDA on November 11th they were going to start again. I think they started November 22nd. Does that sound roughly correct?
Yeah, and pretty much everything, that entire timeline that you're referring to, was prior to our engagement and ownership of ProRx. So that would have all been managed under previous owners, different operators. So, our timeline with ProRx essentially started in 2025.
Okay. I'm curious to jump. So there was another FDA warning letter, March. There's amended warning letter. It initially went on in December, and then was made public March 4th, 2025, and then a new 43 in September 19th of 2025. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious, like, obviously you read the initial warning letter, you made improvements, kind of like, tell me about that time period.
Well, there was a lot of work to be done in 2025. And, as you just referenced, when you're talking about the pharmacy space and, an inspection, the analogy that I make for a lot of people that's easy to understand, it would be this, perhaps the equivalent of being pulled over in a traffic stop. And you could be cited for something as small as speeding, or you could have a taillight that's not working properly, or it could be something large and enormous. So during any time of the inspection, it's very likely that if they come to your facility, they're going to make an observation of some type. That's their job, is to make it better, to make it, they're going to find something and look for it. So as you move through 2025, in March, the FDA consultants that we have were consistently following protocol, in communication with the FDA. We're documenting everything that's had been done and what we had still been working on. And then I think if you're going to go, did you ask about the? Well, I'll cap it there and allow you. Yeah, I digress.
I'm kind of curious, like, when the FDA inspects a 503B like ProRx, what I've heard happens in their pharmacies is they will literally set up cameras and just like sit and watch for like a week, sometimes longer. Is that accurate?
It certainly can be. I think the concept and the idea for every operator, whether you're 503A or 503B, and 503B is much more stringent. It's federally regulated versus a state board. The idea is that you've done everything correct up until that point, and to the fact of all the observations that may have been made previously, you want to fix those. You want to have the inspection come in, and then you want to make it as easy for them as you can, and that's by doing our job. But yeah, to see that or hear that there could be an inspection that lasts for a week long, yeah, that's all possible.
Yeah, and then I'm kind of curious, outside of the letters, what's a 503B's relationship with the FDA like? Do you talk to them, email them, ask questions, ask clarification, or is it sort of like they're there to inspect and then otherwise you don't really communicate with them?
The correspondence in nearly entirety is between the FDA and your compliance team and who you have that's responding back and forth to them. And there's a particular workflow on how that information goes back and forth. It wouldn't be me personally communicating with the FDA. It would be our hired consultants. And typically these are people that have worked with the FDA for years or even worked on the other side of the fence for the FDA and understand everything that there is to know about the industry. And if there's an observation that's made, how quickly can we fix it? And then we need to document that and have that information be sent to the FDA.
Yeah. And I guess for the audience, and correct me if I'm saying anything wrong here, 503Bs are registered with the FDA. They get inspected by the FDA. 503As don't necessarily get inspected by the FDA unless the FDA is like triaging. They think something's wrong. They heard adverse events. And the 503As do more of the personalization aspect. 503Bs are able to supply other medical entities like a hospital.
That is correct.
A lot of 503Bs supply medication to hospitals, supply custom formulations to hospitals, but not necessarily customizing directly to patients.
You have it perfectly correct.
Yeah. And then to get into the meat and potatoes, why did ProRx stop compounding GLP-1s?
Yeah, that's not the first time I've heard that question. I think you'd have to understand the entire timeline. It was looking for ProRx as a piece of our infrastructure that was backed up in a time when GLPs were on the shortage. They were put on the shortage list by the FDA. So the FDA had asked the 503Bs to kick into production and to support the market because the brand medication wasn't there. So we absolutely participated in that part. Mind you, going in, we had an entire whiteboard of formulations and medications that we had mapped out over the course of the entire year. And amazingly, during the shortage and in the early parts of 2025, we were still able to bring six, seven, maybe 8 of our formulations to market in the midst of all of this, which for any pharmacy, 503A or 503B, to formulate those and put them all together and do so quickly would be a feat in itself, which we were able to do. I think if I had to really think about it, as 2025 went on, March was when the FDA had removed the GLPs from the shortage list. It was in March. Mm-hmm. And, it was no secret, ProRx, we decided to stay in production. And the reason, I would say 2 main factors. And the first one is the most important reason, which is we had providers, clinicians, physicians' offices calling us literally every day, looking to source. We have 700 patients. We're looking to source medication. Preferably, we need to have this medication shipped bulk to, a singular location. And so then combine that with, litigation that had just started, and it still is active litigation, challenging the FDA's decision on removing the GLPs from the shortage list, and even perhaps how that data was aggregated to say that the demand in the market had been met. We continued into production. It was never a question of if we were going to stop producing. It was a matter of when. And I think that really became a little bit more internal to us, knowing our greater and larger business plan, which we really needed to get back to. And, at that point in time, there was a lot of things going on in the industry. You mentioned the letter, the April 1st letter that went out. I didn't personally take that really much differently than the position that FDA had already postured on it, which is don't make it. It's off the shortage list. I think that April 1st letter had received a lot more publicity than maybe everything in the past. So perhaps it seemed more significant, but really just looking at it as a whole, the market went from critical need and providing patients what's needed to large sales funnels, patients that are having async physicians visits. It just seemed that maybe the environment was kind of leaning more into a sales environment than an environment where patients absolutely needed medications. They couldn't be found. It was something that we had already planned, and it was a good time for us to exit. We had reported, so one of the regulations in the 503B space is that you absolutely have to report to the FDA what you've compounded, right? So we followed protocol the entire time. We were completely open and honest about it with the FDA. We told them and documented everything that we had produced. I can't say the same for the rest of the 503B space. So for us, it was time. It was time to do it. There's no perfect time.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of curious because when it happened, people are like, oh, is it because the FDA told ProRx that they couldn't do GLP-1s anymore directly?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a lot of speculation. I mean, I think I saw, and I noticed maybe the first, the news that really kind of came out, there was speculation that that's why ProRx stopped producing, maybe there was something along those lines. And then I think it was just a couple of days later that there was another large 503B compounder that had stopped with production. And then I saw different speculation as to, well, maybe this isn't this, but maybe it's that, right? The story really just remains the same. The position that the FDA took starting in March of 2025 was no different then than it was in April and is no different as it is today, which is they've essentially told the 503B space to stop producing.
Okay. But, March was like a year ago and April was recently. I guess to ask directly, did the FDA specifically contact you and talk about GLP-1s as something that was being compounded?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, there was never a situation where, that was market, and I would say anything that came towards ProRx was no different than what was directed to the industry as a whole.
Okay. So you don't think it was like the FDA? So like, there's some speculation the FDA specifically picked on ProRx because they didn't like ProRx because of the 483s. You think you had no special communication with the FDA around GLP-1s?
There was ongoing communication. They knew that we were producing them.
Yeah.
As to why we stopped producing, it wasn't really anything related to April 1st. We have regular and open correspondence with the FDA on previous observations that have been made and what we've done to correct, and to work on those and document that back and forth with the FDA. So, my position, I mean, that's the truth of it.
Okay. I'm also curious because I saw kind of like as we were getting started that you're actually destroying GLP-1s you had previously produced. Is that true?
Yeah, that's what the FDA asks you to do. So if you have, you have to destroy it. So that's absolutely true.
Interesting. Because I think like I've heard of other 503Bs in the space potentially, like if it's already made, supplying it to a 503A that then would distribute what's already been made, but they're like, we're not going to make any more. Instead, you're like, we're actually going to destroy the product that we've already made.
Yeah. Well, it's easy to look at it from that perspective, but then you have to understand the internal operations of what's happening behind the scenes, which is, at all times you have, a full pharmacy staff that's compounding medications. Those medications are then set off to testing. And, there could be multiple and many batches. Some of this testing takes 7 days, 10 days, could be as much as 2 weeks or sometimes longer for the results to come back. It just depends on the lab, what's going on. Sometimes these timelines are faster, sometimes they're not. Sometimes certain labs are faster than others. So you're almost always going to have, a 7 to 14 day window of product that was already made that's sitting in quarantine. So, yeah. And it's not so a choice that's so much made around monetization as it is just making a decision, because regardless of when you make that choice, you're going to have product and testing. That's just how that's going to work.
Yeah. Okay. And then did you see the announcement from the FDA today? I know I didn't ask you before we started recording about it was a proposal to remove all GLP-1s, semaglutide, tirzepatide, liraglutide from the 503B bulks list.
I am aware, yes.
Yeah. What's your initial reaction to that? Was that something you expected to come, or are you surprised?
Not surprised. It's not expected. Not, I think that, everything is in play here. I'm not necessarily surprised to see it or to hear it. No.
Yeah. And so is it your expectation that, say, like, in the next few months, all 503Bs will cease making GLP-1s?
Yeah, I couldn't speculate on other companies, but
Sure.
I mean, I can look at it just from my perspective as a business owner. If it's public information that other 503Bs have already made the decision, maybe that does increase pressure slightly, but in the end, it comes down to each business. ProRx, again, as I said, we reported everything that we produced to the FDA. I also can't say the same thing for every other 503B that's out there. They may not report until June of this year. So it's a hard one, right? And I really couldn't speculate on it.
Yeah. And I'm curious because I've heard this is a rumor for another 503B that they were told by the FDA that they were going to fine them for making GLP-1s like for every vial. That's like not something that you heard from the FDA at all, is it?
Well, no, that's not anything that was directed towards ProRx, but I'm not surprised to hear that. Yes, whether it be factual or not.
Yeah, it's just a rumor, so I have no idea if it's accurate. But
yeah, no, they're pretty serious about it, right? So that's the deal. They've made that known.
Yeah. So I think, when we spoke briefly before we were recording, you kind of mentioned that 503Bs are making a tremendous amount of GLP-1s, just broadly. What do you think is going to happen to compounded GLP-1 supply if 503Bs stop making GLP-1s?
I think for your viewing audience, this is the most important question of the entire interview, because it has to be recognized and understood that the 503B space was compounding millions of vials that were going into the patient market on a monthly basis. And when you pull that out of the market, and if you do so quickly, the already stressed supply chain is now completely dependent on the 503A space and brand manufacturers, right? I've spoken to, maybe 3, 4, 5, a half dozen pharmacy owners that I know that are in the A space, and they're very nervous. They're turning away business. Their business is to have providers send prescriptions to their pharmacy, and they're turning them away because they're already oversaturated with the business that they have. 503A pharmacies that had a 36 to 48 hour turnaround window are now at 1 to 2 weeks. And, I think this is just really the beginning of it. We're going to see how fast the market can adapt, but what's at risk here is patient access. That's the takeaway, what's most important. And, if there's some type of regulation that's put on the 503, I mean, they've already, have addressed the A space. I haven't studied it to the detail, but, the question I pose in reverse, can the 503A space and the brand manufacturer space handle the total demand to entities? And part two, B to that question, if the A space was removed, what would happen then?
Yeah. Do you think if all compounded GLP-1s went away, that the injectable medication would go into the FDA-approved versions would go into shortage?
My personal opinion is they would. Whether or not they would be put on the shortage list, I could only speculate, and I wouldn't do it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Like, we don't know if, even if they were harder to find, if the FDA would put it into shortage after they've gone through this whole mess dealing with putting them on and off the shortage and getting litigation about them being off the shortage.
Remember, there's ongoing litigation from 2025 challenging the original decision.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you think that 503As will continue to be able to compound GLP-1s?
For the patient's sake and for patient access, I certainly hope so. As to what will happen, I don't have a crystal ball.
Do you have, like, what percentage chance do you think it's gone in the next 6 months? I'm just kind of curious. Like 50%, 70% chance it's gone, 10% chance it's gone?
Just a guess, gun to head, 50%. And I know that's an arbitrary number right in the middle.
Yeah.
I think it would be understood that if the 503A space were removed entirely and the entire demand fell on brand, I'm not privy to the information and what their capacity is. So I don't have an understanding of what's there and how quickly they can react from that side. And that's why I say 50-50.
Yeah. That makes sense. Do you have any sense of, like, if the FDA wanted to stop 503A, like, compounding of GLP-1s, do you think they would pursue warning letters? Do you think they would, like, what kind of path do you think they would take? And I know this is speculative and you may not have a good answer. I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I mean, there is some speculation built into it, but when the FDA, you listen, you have to listen, you have to follow regulation, right? I mean, that's really just it. And if you don't, ultimately, there can be warnings and you have to get better and do certain things. But if you just don't listen, you're probably going to have a problem with them.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So I'm kind of curious. One of my concerns, if all compounded GLP-1s went away and were no longer accessible, is that it's going to drive a lot of patients to the research or gray market space. And I personally believe that the number of GLP-1 patients who are on gray market is actually higher than the number of GLP-1 patients who are on compounded. I'm curious, like, how do you view that entire marketplace and kind of the ability to shut that down or not shut that down?
Well, I don't think we have to look too far into history to understand exactly how that works and where any speculation needs to be made. If we went back really just 5 years ago, we saw that there were a number of peptides that were removed from category 1 and placed on a category 2 list, which is do not compound. The policy changed, but the demand did not. In fact, the demand was rapidly increasing at that period of time. So in fact, what happened was the policy pushed the business into the R&D market in the peptide space. They're not going away. They're looking for it. They're going to order it, right? If they can find it. And then we saw really what happened as a result of that was a plethora of online storefronts selling research and development product that hasn't gone through the regulatory supply chain and with chain of custody from the API manufacturers, making sure that they're FDA registered, that they've been inspected, that these facilities are CGMP production quality. There was no records of the pharmaceutical ingredients being shipped through customs into the United States, at what temperature they were at, how they were stored, how long they sat, where they sat at. And, really we got into an area of history, which was don't ask, just inject. That's what was created, the environment, right? So I would say, without speculation, if that would happen, we've already, and I hope, learned our lesson from what happened through that process, which the FDA and RFK and his associates are working through right now to legitimately study these peptides, their medical value, their safety. It's been in the news, and then put those same products back in the hands of regulated channels to be sure that they are safe and they are effective and they are prescribed, and all of this for patient safety. So to your point, I think it's already been proven what will happen or what could happen.
Yeah. So if like compounded GLP-1s went away, it would feel like a medical prohibition, really. Like in the 1920s when there was prohibition and people couldn't have alcohol, and it just created a lot of issues. But instead, this is our access to healthcare and to what I think is probably the most important medication that has been invented in our lifetimes, right?
Yeah, this is a very critical time. It's an environment where the supply chain was already stressed, is becoming even more stressed. So we can only, hope for the best. I think someone asked me a question the other day. How do you see the 503A or the compounding space in the FDA in the future? And my answer to that was, simply put, I hope that there's a way that both sides can work together seamlessly and smooth, and in a way to continue to provide patient access. As you and I both know how important it is for people to have medications of necessity and be sure that they're safe for use, right?
Yeah, I recently toured a compounding pharmacy. It's on my YouTube if you want to check it out. But one of my big takeaways was that I felt like my perspective of sterility changed, right? When people are doing research and like maybe they're getting a C of A, maybe it is actually what they're getting, maybe they're not. But when they're making injectable medications in their kitchen, even if their kitchen is really, really clean, there's no way that compares to the level of sterility that I observed in all the compounding pharmacies that I visited. I guess like when you think about the patient who's, making medication in their kitchen, what are your concerns? Like, what do you think the risks are?
Coming from a person that works in the background and have for years with pharmaceutical ingredients, and knowing the manufacturers and understand the vetting process, understanding the COAs, and understanding all of the testing, if you look at perhaps like a research grade product, it has a COA that is referencing the purity or the potency, right? And that's what everyone's cluing into. There are dozens. There are a dozen of other markers on there. Could be endotoxins, could be bacteria, could be mold, there's pH, and there are things that aren't even tested for, other impurities that may not even, if they're not testing for them, they won't even show up on the test in the first place, right? So yeah, it could be very scary. What can happen. And I've heard some stories of what have happened to people that were using research grade products before. I'm not going to fearmonger, but I've heard them.
It's just a totally different level of vetting and sterility. I think we can agree.
Completely different. Yeah. From the source, it starts at the sourcing and the manufacturing of it all, just the ingredients themselves.
Yeah. I'm curious because you're also in the active pharmaceutical ingredient space. Like, what do you think of the proposed tariffs on active pharmaceutical ingredient? How do you think that's going to impact compounding pharmacies?
My personal opinion, and this is something that I'm working towards, and hopefully to completion here very soon, is having the ability to reshore pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturing here in the United States. In my opinion, that's what it needs to be. That's what it wants to be. Relying on foreign sources. 90% of the world's pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical ingredients come from China and India, right? My opinion is that we should be doing this here in the United States with the oversight of the FDA and making sure that these products are always available for Americans and that we're not depending on anyone else. And then that and the quality of it and likely maybe even the cost, could be cost reduction for these patients by doing so.
Yeah, I'm curious. Can you shed light on, like, given your unique background, like, why are compounding pharmacies so secretive of their API sources?
Well, my experience is that they shouldn't be. If I've had different interviews and people say if you were a clinician and you were speaking to different compound pharmacies, what are the questions that should be asked to them, right? And one of the very first questions that should be asked to a pharmacy is, where are they sourcing the pharmaceutical ingredients? Do they have the particular COA? Is there any third-party testing to it? And, because it starts there, right? There are a number of other things I would look at as a clinician when deciding on which compound pharmacy to work with, but where the product comes from is a pretty important one,
Yeah, I'm also curious, have you been following or seeing any of the state legislation that is anti-compounding, that is directly focused on compounding pharmacy standards for active pharmaceutical ingredients? Are you familiar with this?
Well, if you're referring to, are you referring to the FDA's green list that they published?
No, not the FDA's green list. It's bills that are coming up in state legislature that is trying to impose standards on active pharmaceutical ingredient that the compounding pharmacy must enforce.
Yeah. I'm aware. Self-admittedly, I haven't studied it deep. A lot of times when I see some of this, I see that it's proposed legislation that's tied to 5 other items.
Right.
I think there's 2 sides on every fence. Without getting into politics, what one viewpoint is versus a second viewpoint, and I just see that as maybe politics.
Well, we don't need to get too much into politics. I'm not trying to make a political channel, but these state legislative bills have been supported by both Republicans and Democrats, depending on what state they're raised in.
Have been, yes.
Yeah. It kind of just depends on the flavor of the state that brought the legislation forth, what party that they are in. I guess, like, when you look at the compounding ecosystem, it feels to me like there is very obvious palpable tension between large pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, who generally don't like compounding, and kind of like access to medication that may need to be customized or maybe in shortage, and like the critical infrastructure that compounding presents in the United States. How do you see that tension playing out over the years?
I can't say how I see it playing out. What I would like to see, what I would love to see, is the corporate pharmaceutical space being able to work hand in hand with the compounding space in particular ways, and I think that there could be ways to do it. The compounding space, I would hope that it's not seen as a competitor, right? It does serve many purposes, many important purposes for patients. We don't have to go into that list, but if they could work together, both sides can win, and ultimately the patients win in the end.
Yeah, I think that there's this interesting dynamic in U.S. healthcare where, naturally occurring things like naturally occurring peptides cannot be patented, right? And generally speaking, for something to have a ton of research behind it, like to be FDA approved, pharma needs to have a way to patent it, right? And historically, compounding has stepped in and allowed access to therapies that otherwise wouldn't have access. I'll give that example, desiccated thyroid, right? Which is like a naturally occurring thing that people use to help regulate their thyroid if they've had it removed or have autoimmune issues related to thyroid.
Armor thyroid.
Yeah. And so compounding pharmacies can access natural forms of desiccated thyroid that pharma can't patent, right, in that example. And then that gives patients unique access to treatment they couldn't otherwise get. When you think about the tension between can pharma patent it and can compounders compound it, I guess, like, how do you think that tension in the United States is going to play out? Because peptides is an example of, like, people see potential in these medications. Most of them are honestly not studied that well. But if they can't be patented by pharma, then they will never be studied as well as we may want them to be as patients. Like, how do you see that playing out?
You know, I would love to give you a direct answer, but I can only tell you that it's speculation. I've seen some dramatic improvements. This is my personal opinion, with the FDA and their position and their willingness to look at some of these products, formulas, peptides, and things of that nature, and making it accessible for patients, right? If we stay on that track and that trend, I think that things get better. But I think it could also go in an opposite direction, where we have to, you have particular sets of years and different administrations, and 5 years, 4 years goes by rather quickly, right? But what we're seeing right now, I think, is very important, and the FDA and their willingness to put the patients first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we're seeing here. It's not a bipartisan or partisan issue. They're simply looking to benefit the patients with what I personally am witnessing, and that's my feeling on it.
Yeah.
Long term, I would only be speculating.
Yeah, I think, like, I somewhat agree with you, somewhat disagree with you. So, like, when you look at the stuff from the FDA today about removing GLP-1s from the 503B bulk situation,
yes,
FDA framed it as they are defending their drug approval process, which is basically saying we're defending the patents of pharma companies, right? And I think when you look at the tremendous health benefits from GLP-1s, like, you could only argue for patients, the most valuable thing is affordable access, affordable, safe access to those medications. Getting rid of compounded GLP-1s would obviously reduce the access and potentially send patients down paths like the gray market that is less safe.
Right.
I guess, like, how do you square that with what you just said? Like,
it's not, well, you can't. Yeah, no, you blew a hole right through it. But seeing them having the awareness of the importance of peptides, in my opinion, is better than ignoring that and removing the GLPs from the bulk list altogether.
Sure. I mean, peptides is something. It's a bone you can throw to compounders. I think it's interesting because I think the Trump administration and in their healthcare is obviously very chaotic compared to almost any other administration we've had before. And they are at times strangely anti-pharma, and then other times seem in alignment with pharma, right? I guess, like, when you hear that they're coming out with policies, like, you're expecting them, I guess, to bring peptides to compounders and to increase peptide accessibility, right?
I'm not sure what my exact expectation is. The willingness to look at it is a start.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's mostly what I'm referring to here, is the continued look, and as opposed to just doing nothing and pushing it to the side. It's a small step at that, right? And your point is made. It's a contradiction in statement to say that and then look at the bulks list at the same time. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really getting into politics, but to look at the Trump administration's, like, perspective on health, it's like they're very chaotic, they're very disruptive, and then in other ways they aren't. And I feel like you kind of don't know what you're going to get from them all the time, because, like, clearly, I guess I'm curious if the April 1st statement from the FDA, the bulks list statement from the FDA about GLP-1s, do you think this is kind of a consequence of the relationship the Trump administration has with the pharma companies and their most favored nations negotiations that they have done?
I think throughout history and years, there's relationships between administrations and corporate America that are working together for certain ways, and maybe at public facing, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe it doesn't need to make a lot of sense. That entire conversation is one where I don't know that anyone has an answer, or could project what might happen in a year or in 5 years, right? I mean, that's just a difficult one. It's definitely a topic of conversation, but I don't think not one that comes out with any definitive real projection of what might happen.
Yeah. I guess like one question I have is like, if you were a patient on compounded GLP-1s, you give it a 50% chance that compounded GLP-1s go away in the next few months. Would you stock up? Like, what would you do? Because that's what everybody in the comments is going to be like. Should we stock up? Is this an emergency?
Yeah. So there's different types of patients that are on GLPs, right? Some of them are on GLPs for diabetes, some of them for different reasons. There's a segment of the population that are using GLPs predominantly for weight loss, right? I think that's a fair statement. When you look at a medical clinic, a medical practice, there's the practice needs to have a diverse portfolio, and there are more protocols and different products and other ways to address the same issue, which could be obesity, could be, insulin resistance, could be fatty liver, could just be, weight loss in general. And my best advice to those patients and those clinics is to look at medical care in a more diversified portfolio instead of one track of therapy, which is GLP-1s, which is what has happened to certain medical clinics and some, and not offering a comprehensive program that all really works to the same way, right? Which could be weight reduction, lowering an A1C, decreasing, affecting insulin sensitivity and things like that. I don't think I could tell a patient that they should go out and stock up. I know some people are of that mentality, because the things could be perfectly smooth in the next 6 months. Remember, a lot of this conversation, unfortunately, is based around speculation. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. GLP-1s have been a major wave for compounding pharmacies, for telehealth in the space, and you alluded to both in like your answer and a previous answer that you don't always like how telehealth is approaching GLP-1 prescriptions. I'm curious to kind of hear more about that.
I don't necessarily have an opinion on how they approach it. I think the context of the question was surrounding ProRx and our timing of our decision as for us to leave the market. I'm certainly not an antagonist, don't have an antagonist perspective or point of view on a patient that likes telemedicine and needs patient access and to see an online provider. I was more so referring to perhaps how the industry was shifting, and at that time, right, when we made the decision.
Yeah. Do you think, it doesn't seem that way given the FDA's proposal to remove GLP-1s from the 503B bulks list. But if you continue to see all 503Bs that are currently compounding GLP-1s continue to compound GLP-1s for 12 months, would you look at that and be like, ProRx fucked up. We made a bad business decision. We probably should have stayed in making GLP-1s.
Yeah, no. And the reason you have to have longevity in the space. My personal feeling is that any 503B that is still producing and continues to produce, they're inviting a lot of trouble. But more importantly for us, to be perfectly honest, and people are shocked to hear this answer sometimes, I'm happy to move forward with ProRx and get back to our original business plan and everything that we were working on and which we're currently working on. There's a number of, facility upgrades that are underway with automation, robotics, build outs within the facility to enhance floor space. And, a lot of those plans, have been shelved, for the last so many months because you're busy doing other things, right? So again, if you remember, a larger business model here,
Mm.
there are other products, and some of them I consider to be pioneer products, which is what really excites me in this space.
Yeah, I think when you say pioneer products, I've heard of a lot of compounding pharmacies trying to like get access to unique formulations, unique delivery methods, and then sort
Exactly.
of making unique products you can't get anywhere else. Is that what you're
That
also
is
talking? That's what you're talking about.
that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, different delivery systems and things like that. Um, certain products and products that patients need that maybe have been tried before, but they didn't really yield the result that was needed. So, yeah, there's a lot going on in the background with what we're doing, and
Yeah,
you can't get into a lot of that work intensively. Even automation and robotics and what it takes to build out a room, and this is a lot of downtime for a pharmacy to be able to do this.
yeah, absolutely. I heard a rumor, since you were talking about upgrading the facility, I heard a rumor that you were taking equipment out of your 503B and putting it into an A to potentially do GLP-1s. Can you confirm or deny?
There's all kind of speculation. Perhaps we were moving it so we could do work in that particular area. That would be another way to say it. No, I don't think that's the case. We have plenty of work ahead of us at ProRx.
Yeah, I guess like when you look over like the next year, like what are you most excited about? Is it the pioneer? Is that what you said? I can't remember. Or is it the special, unique treatments? Is it kind of like where do you see compounding going?
Well, it's what I'm excited about, what I'm working on, have been working on, and where I'm going. This is what excites me. Obviously, this is where I've dedicated my life direction, which is it's infrastructure. When you look at the business model of medical clinics that are working with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different compound pharmacies for patient fulfillment, that's a burden at the hands of the medical clinic to have to send a prescription order for one patient to 3 different pharmacies and to be able to manage that workflow collectively. Second to that, the compounding space in general, there probably, as it currently stands, there's not enough compounding production capability in the United States to handle what's ahead of us in the next 24 to 36 months. So building out infrastructure for medical clinics and essentially the end user, which is the patient, for patient access.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything you wish I'd asked about, or?
I thought you've done a wonderful job, and I think if there was an exclamation point to put on the interview, it would go back to the question surrounding the consequences of removing 503B and 503A compounding out of the market and what that might mean for patient access.
Yeah, I mean, bees alone is devastating for access.
Yes,
Even
it's being felt right now in a very real way already.
How long do you think it will take for that to be felt more severely? If just bees are leaving, is it like 3 months, 4 months?
I don't know who is stopping. I don't keep it. Doesn't it's not my business, right? But this is going to sound crazy. If they all stop today, there'd be a major problem. Even though the products are not on the shortage list. Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
We would feel it within a week or 2.
Yes.
And when you talk about how the compounding supply chain is already strained, what are the most strained portions of the supply chain?
So policy can change, right? But infrastructure could take months or years to change. So, there could be a decision that's made and says, this is how it has to happen. Well, it starts with the raw ingredients, who's making those, how they can be made, how fast they can be made, how they are, how they have port of entry into the United States, how customs is working. Is customs being funded? That's been a question here recently. If they're not being funded and they're understaffed, how long does it take to get these ingredients into the country if the inspectors are not working, or they're overworked, or not as many of them are working? So that's a bottleneck in itself, which is the manufacturing of the products, knowing that 90% of the manufacturing comes from offshore, right?
Yeah.
You throw in the tariffs, which you mentioned, that can be a limiting factor. And then regulation on top of that, on the interior side, on the space, these are all things that are already bottlenecks and stressing the system.
Yeah. I think if you could change one thing about the supply chain, what would you change? Or fund one portion of it, what would it be? Would it be customs?
A large area of the bottleneck, I believe that reshoring pharmaceutical manufacturing this is a cliche statement that it's a matter of national security, but in a sense, it very much is. And I think that is the most important piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
outside of the pharmacies, right? The compounding space, being able to support these patients, because I believe the data is vastly skewed on how many patients are receiving prescriptions for compounded GLPs in the United States. I don't think most people would have any idea.
You think it's far undercounted? You think it's more?
I do.
Okay. Interesting. And then for a final question, what's the dumbest thing you've seen or misconception you've seen about compounding pharmacies, on Reddit or social media or wherever?
The dumbest. I don't know. I would call it dumb. It's, online and this is how it works. Every pharmacy at one point in time is going to have an issue. They're going to have an observation. They could have a 483. They could be backed up for 2 or 3 weeks on shipping timelines. On the messaging, the message boards and the Reddits and things like that, I see how quick people either take information, it's misinterpreted, not fully understood, speculation is made, and everybody jumps on the bandwagon. They're the bad guy. And then next month, it's somebody else. And the group that was the month before is no longer in the news, and no one is talking about them ever again until it's their turn again. I won't say that that's the dumbest thing, but I would say it's a thing to be mindful of. And I'm always happy to come public and talk, and just speak the truth. I think more people should. I think more pharmacy owners should, so that it's well understood. If the information isn't there, then it only leaves room for speculation.
So if you get another 483, you'll come back?
Yes. No, it's, I'm not going to say yes or no, but I would love to visit with you again. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and joining and answering all of my questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to meet with you. And I wish you great success with the brand and the channels that you're creating. Great job.